change his opinion, okay, at all. So let's just understand what's going on. Here's what Jesus is saying. He's saying, hey, for immorality, the word there for immorality, the Greek word for immorality is where we actually get pornography. Okay? So, it's porneia. And it covers a multitude of sexual sins. It's not just, fornication. It's not, adultery. It's a wide range, okay? But again, you have to understand, where's God coming from? God sees marriage in two ways. One, he sees marriage from a human perspective. A man and a woman come together. They love each other. They have that union. They become one. They have that sex. They procreate. And boom, children come in. Now those children fall underneath the same umbrella. God, the Father, the wife, and the children. And that family is supposed to be teaching children who God is. But what's happening is that when we allow sexual immorality, or when we allow divorce to come into the picture, we're no longer focusing on God. Who are we focusing on? Yeah, I'm focusing on my needs. And the culture today says, oh, we're just a bunch of animals. Go look at the dogs. Go look at, the cats. Or they go off and they chase each other. So, hey, we're just an animal. We're no longer in the image of God, according to the world's standards. And because we're no longer in the image of God, we can do whatever we want to do. So be it. Because, in the world's mind, there is no heaven or hell. We die, we're back to dust, move on. But that's not what Scripture teaches. That's not what God teaches. And what God teaches is that there is a purpose behind marriage. Twofold. One, because of a husband and wife in the procreation of children, in the building of a nation. And so even when Moses was having to deal with all this stuff that was going on, and again, you have to understand, a lot of the rules and laws that were given in Leviticus and Deuteronomy repeating, besides not talking about the Ten Commandments, but all that was basically to help purge a generation of people who've been stuck in bondage for 200+ years. And so they've just been surrounded by so much paganism that God started to set them apart from the pagan world. And so yes, they were having to go by certain rules and regulations and laws to help them break away from the paganism of what the world was already doing. So what goes on here is, and the second reason. So the second reason, one is for man and woman, but then you got to understand where God sees this. Because just like how Paul talked in Ephesians, I'm going to tell you, and the word he uses, if you remember how Cliff taught this, I'm going to tell you a mystery. I'm going to tell you a mystery. The mystery is a secret knowledge of God. And God's revealing this because when God sees divorce, he sees it between what he's created, but he also sees what divorce does in the big scheme of things. Because when you start to think about it, we'll see this in a few minutes, but let's go back to the Ten Commandments. What's the first Ten Commandment? What's the first commandment?
Love the Lord.
Yeah, love the Lord your God. There's only one God. Second, hey, don't have any other idols. Third, don't use God's name in vain. Fourth, keep the Sabbath day when God holy. Okay, so the first 4 commandments of the Old Testament of the 10 Commandments were all about God and our relationship with God. Then when it starts, and I really do believe there's an order in some respects to this. When you start with the rest of the 6 commandments afterwards, the first one comes after that is what? Honor your mom and dad. Even, and I tell kids this, even if you come from a broken family like I did, you still have to have an honor and respect because guess what? It wasn't your decision who your mom and dad was going to be. It was God's decision. And if God knew the type of situation I was going to grow up in, then God knew what was going to happen down the road if I would put my trust in him. Yes, sin allowed for a lot of stuff to happen in my life that should never happen. It happens to other kids that I hate to hear when it happens.
But
It
it
tears my heart apart because I've been through a lot of that. But the problem is, that's sin. I'm still to, even though my mom didn't like me, I'm still to honor my mom. She was my mom. She was the one that God said, hey, Marty, you're going to be born of this woman. Despite her sinfulness, you're coming through that seed.
And all her shortcomings and her inabilities and all the imperfections of our, like you say, we didn't choose our parents.
Right.
But it's a sign of maturity when you can see past all of the, like I said, the above.
Well, I mean, without that, you wouldn't be where you are standing
If
right
it was
now.
God's
Yeah.
plan anyway.
But and the thing is,
You know,
is
so
I've been married now
Buck
for
up.
40 years. How many years you been married?
56.
Okay, and so here's the thing. I honor that.
34.
I honor that. I mean, and and when I
20.
Going on 11.
going on 11, 7,
20.
20. See, you think about this. I mean, when we were starting off as a young couple, yes, because my wife, I love my wife dearly. Divorce was never an option, period. We get in arguments, sometimes we get down in some bitter arguments. Marty's, because of Marty's past, this is leading to divorce, we might go ahead and do it. It's just, it's the way it is. And Marty would think about it. Linda would never think about it. I mean, I'm gonna be honest with you.
She didn't come from divorced parents.
She didn't come from divorced parents.
She was working it out, period.
And Marty would never follow through with it because Marty had a commitment to God, and is always, even though when I get mad and I know I wasn't doing what God wanted me to do, I still had down deep inside me a Holy Spirit that was grieving the hound out of me, saying, Marty, wake up.
Boy,
Stop being a baby and a whiner, and let's get through this. A marriage that lasts, is not a marriage because it's a perfect marriage. There's no such thing as a perfect marriage. Even, think about this, even Christ, who is the husband of the bride, is the bride a perfect bride?
No.
Nowhere close. I think it was Chuck Colson or Tony Campello. One of the books I read a long time ago says, and he was describing, said, you can see this before you have in every Revelation, before you have this banquet, and the bride and the Christ, appear in Revelation, stuff like that. He says, here's what Christ is seeing. He's seeing a bride walking down the aisle, filthy, torn up dress. Everything else is torn all apart and everything else, and yet his blood is just taking that and just turning. It's almost like the Cinderella story is just turning that whole ugly-looking vessel into something beautiful. Not because of anything the bride did, it's because of what Christ had done. And so we sit here and we look at this, and so, so they get through this. And again, God hates divorce for two reasons. One, because of what his plan was between man and woman, but also because he sees divorce as in a spiritual perspective. And I don't know if y'all, I've been a member of several different churches in this area, but I went to a church, I don't want to give names, but I've been to a church that went through a major separation. Another church joined or was formed out of this separation of the church, okay?
Oh, split.
It was a split. And that split, honestly, when we was going through it and stuff like that, we as members of the church, in my family, we were trying to decide, well, which parent do we go to? And this
Isn't
kind of
that fairly prevalent in the Bible Belt? I mean, when you drive through the country and there's a church on every corner, isn't that how it kind of happens?
Yes, no.
That friendly split,
Pursuit
that kind of-
is not a split church.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
So you gotta understand this. Pursuit is not a split church. Pursuit was a Harvest Cove before Pursuit.
And it
Was-
was nothing before that.
Huh?
There was nothing before that.
And it was the Spirit moving certain groups of people. And
That's what happened.
Mark Cale, one of them,
Right.
but a certain group of people to say, hey, I want to do more in this area. So they started a new church, not split from a church. Now, yes, they left another church,
Right.
but the church didn't split because of
It
them.
was still a friendly thing. There's
Right.
There's no animosity. I'm not trying
There
to
was-
raise no hand. It's a friendly split off.
Right. But
yeah.
churches that do split off, it's like a divorce.
Yeah.
It really was.
Yeah.
because then you had members going, well, which
Politics.
parent are you going to go with? And then, you know, if you went back to one church that you split from, why'd you go with them? You know, and it's like, okay, it didn't work, so we ended up just going to a different church altogether after that split. But you know, God sees this. God, you know, and Jesus says, what was the reason? He said about divorce, unless it's what?
Yes,
For what?
sexual immorality.
So sexual immorality. So let's stop and think about this. From a church perspective, what is sexual immorality?
Stepping out of the faith and doing things you shouldn't.
Yeah. Putting things above God.
Right, changing that order.
Change it, yeah, change it. Yeah. Here's the order. Here. Forget this guy altogether.
Right.
You know, it's all about me. And then, oh, by the way, this one here's going to say, oh, well, I don't want to be a part of it. You, so I want to, you know, and it's all
That's
this
politics.
selfishness.
And it's politics. It's rearranging of the power structure.
Right.
And
And so the sexual immorality from a spiritual perspective is, yeah, we're the bride of Christ. Jerusalem, they were the chosen people of God. And they constantly rebelled. You want to read a sad story, just read Kings. First and 2 Kings, or read First and 2 Chronicles. They both kind of mimic each other. I mean, it's kind of like, yeah, no, and Judges. Read Judges. I mean, it's the same thing. It's kind of like, yeah, no. I mean, and Judges ends with a gruesome story. I'm not going to go. I won't want to get sidetracked. But it's sad. But that's what God's seeing. And He's seeing the sexual immorality of the church, of the believers, who are supposed to be loving God, and yet they're chasing after something else instead of staying in that love relationship that God wanted to have from the very beginning. They had planned, as Paul writes in Ephesians, that He planned before the foundations of the earth. So, now, we get through that.
But there are some, not
Well-
so much around here, but there's a lot of cases where churches get so large that they almost like, not split, but they form another,
well, it gets kind of,
just from
Not-
mere mass.
not to be
And there's
bad.
nothing wrong with that.
Right,
That's
right.
not
That's
split.
right.
Right, that's not split.
In
That
fact, if
happens a
anything,
lot.
that's what should
I don't
happen.
think it happens around here though, does it?
Well, what's happening?
I will say that Grace Covenant in Huntersville started out with just their main campus there, and then they have another campus in East Lincoln, and then they have another
Yeah,
Not
campus
to
in Mooresville.
sound-
Yeah.
nah,
Like
not
Elevation.
sound, but it's
Elevation
almost like
started
split.
down in lower part of Charlotte, and now they're all over in North
There's
Carolina.
one up in Huntersville too.
Yeah.
In the old, what was it, the AMC
Yeah.
theater?
And then Andy Stanley started a church out in outside of Atlanta, and now his church has grown to like 5 or 6 churches. Then there's satellite churches and stuff like that.
Robert
I mean, so
Morgan's
there's a lot of churches like that have done that. There's one church, Matt, we're going to get sidetracked. He's a pastor out in Texas, but he was doing the same model in a sense there, where he was, and then eventually we went to his church when we was taking Josh to go look at seminaries, and we went to his church, and it was funny because it was that same Sunday he announced in his church, he says, "We're stopping this. Each church is going to be their own church, and we're not going to see my sermon and stuff like that. They're going to have their own pastors. We're not going to do," and he broke away from that pattern and stuff like that. The church through Acts was small churches breaking out and stuff like that. Yes, we live in a different type of culture. We got travel, and we can travel anywhere quickly and stuff like that. And so sometimes, unfortunately, people attend church based on emotions than they really truly. And this is a rabbit, but based upon emotions instead of just really wanting to serve God where God has put you. And so what happens is, I don't like this music, so I'm going to go to this church here.
Well, not
And
and flippant, but it's almost like a clique.
Yeah.
You know, you're kind of grooming with folks that have we gravitate towards folks that have similar thought patterns and similar likes and dislikes. So therefore, you know, it kind of pulls you into that clique.
And I'm going to be first to point fingers at myself. I love the hymns, but I also like the modern worship music that we have
You're
today.
right on, but you just hard to get that old school hymn, isn't it?
But
You gotta listen to it on the way.
in the church that my daughter goes to in Florida, they do both,
Mm-hmm.
which is kind of cool. And oh, by the way, what they're doing both, they're not having an organ, they're doing with a band and everything else. I mean, so there's ways of doing this thing, but the problem is that sometimes people go to churches based on emotions instead of really following God's will. Marty's first to point fingers at himself, okay? But anyway, that's what happened. I don't want to dive into that too much. So